Hey, this is a iMovie presentation on the American Revolution by Mark Castillo, Ryder Shifley, and Riley Sprague. American colonies could not gain enough power to create independence because English Parliament represented them as small and insignificant. Many complained taxes were not justifiable and being pinned to the colonists because the colonists didn't see much benefit of the war taxes were funding. Series of taxes were issued, such as the Currency Act, to discontinue the use of American money. This essentially forced American independence on England and eliminated economic freedom for colonial merchants. According to John Green, in his segment of Crash Course U.S. History of Taxes and Smuggling, the British had to pay off an immense debt for a war fought for the sake of American colonial stability. The Americans paid a third of what the British citizens did, and some of the taxes only applied to a small group of people, such as the Stamp Act, which placed a tax on paper-made goods such as newspapers and documents of law. However, because that minority of people were affected by such policies were elites with connections, they were able to rally up even rural people who had nothing to do with the Stamp Act. Colonists were especially upset not necessarily just because of taxes, but because they had no say or power to change them in civil and representative manner. This gave way to the saying, "no taxation without representation," because the British Parliament refused Americans to have a position in their. In addition, the British passed several acts that limited what Americans could do in terms of expansion of land. The Proclamation of 1763 limited colonists from settling land past the Allegheny Mountain Range. The Quebec Act, in an attempt to better their position with the French, expanded Canadian territory farther south, causing the colonists to become irritable and question why they had such restrictions while the French's land was being expanded. The English began to limit the amount of resources that the colonists could use as well, in positions like the king's surveyor would specifically reserve a portion of lumber in a given area of land for the king's use. Again, while these actions from the British can be argued to be fair, the main implication is that the king's exertion of power rendered the Americans unable to do anything in response for as long as the British system controlled American government. Furthermore, the colonists had a right to free trade and should have been able to partake in commerce legally with other nations, but British interference forced Americans into having to rely on the black market and smuggling, and the British were even able to put restrictions on that. The British passed the Tea Act, which gave a monopoly of tea to the East India Tea Company if the company promised to both keep prices very competitive and also give a portion of the earnings back to the empire. This is significant because the British eliminated competition from other European companies, restricting the profit that Americans could gain because the tea market benefited only the colony's mother nation. As a result, the colonists turned to the black market. In the black market, raw resources were especially profitable, and these were restricted trade items because if Britain had allowed the colonies to supply raw goods like timber to the French or the Spanish, those rival nations would be able to build armies and become threats to the British Empire. And even with all of these restrictions, John Green points out that America still had the second best economy in the world. Colonies by nature can never be on par with their mother country because colonies are designed to extract raw materials of which there are limited amounts. But the American lifestyle was still more economically stable and luxurious than that of most parts of the globe. The motives behind the revolution stem from Britain's acts of suppression themselves, which demonstrated that America still did not have its own identity despite having economic growth. Colonists were still an extension. The Boston Massacre is an example of riots. Started out as a standard protest against taxes. However, when some colonists started harassing British soldiers on guard by pelting them with snowballs, the soldiers opened up fire, killing 5 civilian soldiers. The significance of the massacre is found in John Adams, a colonist who successfully defended the soldiers against prosecution in the American court. Because of the uproar that resulted in the ruling that 6 out of the 8 soldiers involved were acquitted of charges, colonial leaders used the incident to spread propaganda that painted the affair as a giant massacre, fueling colonial resentment of their mother country. In addition, the Boston Tea Party, in which colonists dressed up as natives and destroyed a large chunk of tea stock of the East Indian Tea Company, was a response to Britain's Tea Act. According to John Green, the Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea for the Americans, so the only reason the Americans would have to engage in the Tea Party is that their anger was based on spinning the British for imposing the policy. The British government's primary focus in setting up the colonies was obtaining capital and gaining raw resources. Thus, the king's decisions relating to the colonies were set up to maximize this system and not to be best represent the colonists' main interests. While the Americans adopted a similar virtual representation system after being granted independence, Thomas Paine helps put clearly the need for local rather than long distance rule in his pamphlet Common Sense. He makes multiple arguments that logically state that it isn't justifiable that a continent should be ruled by an island, and gives the analogy that the U.S. is like an adult that can't be ruled by their parents. So, according to J. Franklin Jameson in his article The Effect of the American Revolution, the after effects of the revolution also contribute to the molding of American identity by affecting ideology. Jameson thus concludes in his article that the American Revolution was then necessary for social change by taking away the American individual's subordination to Britain. Consequently, the American Revolution is completely justified as a pillar of the American identity because while it may not have been the most effective way to have British imposition of taxes, land restrictions, and free market interference removed, the movement was the only way for colonists to free themselves of the burden of being inherently inferior to Britain and subject to the decisions of the Parliament without question, and to establish their own sovereignty in which they were seen and represented as Americans and not as assets of Britain.